Welcome to the Center for Youth Wellness's training on adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress. In this module, we'll be discussing the hormonal system. The purpose of this module is to understand the difference between normal stress response and uncontrolled stress response, different types of stress, changes in brain architecture due to toxic stress, and dopamine and its impact on your brain. Were you aware there are different kinds of stress? The frequency and strength of the stressor, as well as an individual's coping mechanisms and support, helps to determine how well they respond to stress. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child describes 3 types of stress: normal or positive, tolerable, and toxic. In positive stress, an individual experiences a brief physiological response, such as a change in heart rate, blood pressure, and hormone levels, that then subsides when the stressor is removed. Taking a difficult test or performing in a competition can cause positive stress. During tolerable stress, a more intense stressor causes these changes to happen to a greater degree. However, because of caring relationships and other coping mechanisms, the response is still time limited and is followed by a recovery. Experiencing a loved one's death is a tolerable stressor. Finally, toxic stress occurs when the stressor is most frequent, intense, and unattended by caring relationships and nurturing. It has long-term negative impacts on brain and organ development. Examples of toxic stressors include experiences of abuse, neglect, or caregiver mental illness. Let's begin with the normal stress response. Imagine you're a hunter-gatherer like these people, and you're picking berries in the forest or fishing in the river, and you see a bear. This guy shows up, letting you know under no uncertain terms you have to give up your food now. Your body reacts immediately, telling you to run. You have built-in ways to react to stressors. For example, with the bear, this is beneficial because it'll help you get out of the situation. Or your body might have another reaction. You might stay and fight the bear. Or you might have this response: overwhelmed, freeze. What we've just described is called your fight or flight response. Some call it the fight, flight, or freeze response. Your body responds to protect itself, taking in information through your 5 senses: sight, touch, taste, sound, smell, and immediately tells you what to do next. When you freeze, your bodies become overwhelmed. Chemicals in your brain, or hormones, are the ones that facilitate this process. Hormones tell you how to behave after you've taken intel, letting you know if you're in danger or not. But wait, what are hormones? Let's take a quick moment to define a hormone. A hormone is a regulatory substance transported in tissue fluids such as blood to stimulate specific cells into action. Hormones can be produced naturally or synthetically in the laboratory. A person's hormones can influence behavior or mood. An example of a hormone is cortisol. It's produced naturally and synthetically. For example, the synthetic version of the hormone cortisol is in the topical cream cortisone that people use for skin allergies. The HPA axis is named after 3 components: the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands, more commonly called the HPA axis. Adrenaline is delivered into your neurobiological system via the HPA axis. Remember, one of the chief hormones involved in the body's stress response is adrenaline. Now that we know what hormones are and how they can be delivered, let's think about what they do. Your brain judges a situation and decides if it's a real or a potential threat. It then activates different pathways in the brain to release hormones to help you respond to the stress. Here, the brain perceives a stressor and sends a signal from the hypothalamus to the pituitary and onto the adrenal glands to release adrenaline, one of the main hormones in the stress response. Along with adrenaline and noradrenaline, cortisol is a major hormone released in the stress response. Let's look at what these 3 hormones do. Adrenaline and noradrenaline are responsible for the short-term fight or flight response to stressors. This includes dilated pupils to allow you to see any potential threat more clearly. bronchodilation to allow you to take in lots of oxygen for energy, increased blood flow to muscles to transport all that oxygen in case you need it, increased heart rate, which makes that increased blood flow possible, inhibition of the digestive system so that precious energy is not taken up when it can be used in fighting or fleeing. Cortisol is released by the HPA axis and plays a larger role in the long-term stress response by increasing blood sugar, metabolism of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. All these processes are geared towards helping the body survive a prolonged stressor. Too much cortisol suppresses the immune system. A suppressed immune system means you might get sick. We just reviewed how the normal stress response works. But what happens when the stress response is uncontrolled? Let's think back to brain development and neuroplasticity. Remember that the brain is constantly changing depending on our environment, learning, and experiences. This is a double-edged sword because when those environments and experiences are positive and nurturing, the brain function is growing and improving. If experiences and environments are constantly stressful, brain development moves in the wrong direction. Prolonged or frequent activation of the hormonal systems that respond to toxic stress can have developmental consequences over the long term. An example of developmental consequences would be having an impaired memory or an impaired learning ability. Our body has a system in place to ensure you don't become flooded with stress hormones. Just like water in a bathtub, you have to have a system to turn the water off and on so the bathtub doesn't overflow. This hormonal system is called the negative feedback switch. The body knows that if you have enough stress hormones circulating and acting where you need it, you don't need to keep making more. As cortisol levels rise in the body, the increased level is detected by the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, signaling them to shut down the release of more cortisol. This system allows the body to regulate your stress response. And now we know the stress response is regulated through negative feedback. If the stress response is repeatedly activated or overwhelmed by continuous or severe stressors, the negative feedback switch is disrupted and the stress response is no longer regulated. To put it simply, if the stress response is repeatedly overwhelmed, the brain learns to keep the response activated. Once this dysregulation occurs, the elevated levels of hormones begin to have detrimental effects on the body's systems. Toxic stress can affect multiple body systems and processes. It can affect brain architecture, it can change behavior, metabolism, the immune system, and DNA expression, or epigenetics. Let's talk about the impact of stress hormones on brain architecture. The areas of the brain that are especially sensitive to cortisol levels are the hippocampus, the part of the brain that helps with learning and memory, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for problem solving, and the amygdala. This is the part of the brain that helps us with emotions. When cortisol levels are elevated, the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex decrease and become weaker, while the amygdala becomes enlarged. In other words, when stressed, the part of the brain that helps with strong emotions, like fear, gets larger, and the part of the brain that is for decision making and learning becomes smaller. Studies have found too much cortisol can kill off hippocampal cells, affecting memory. An enlarged amygdala can mean more anxiety. The overall effect is a decrease in learning, mood control, and memory function, and increased anxiety and fear in an individual. Now let's see how uncontrolled cortisol affects the developing brain. The ventral tegmental area, or the VTA, of the nucleus accumbens is the reward center of the brain. This is the part of the brain that regulates and controls behavior by inducing pleasurable effects. Adrenaline and noradrenaline are related to dopamine, a neurotransmitter released by the VTA area of the brain, and that helps us recognize and seek rewards. It reinforces our desire to seek more rewards and allows us to learn what is rewarding or not and motivates us to seek reward again. It boosts productivity when reward is sought. For example, eating delicious food will cause this area of the brain to release more dopamine that leads us to desire the food again. This is the basis for addiction. Stress can cause increased dopamine levels, increasing the risk of certain behaviors such as risky decision making, addiction, and hyperactivity. When the stress response is dysregulated, too much dopamine leads to amplified reward seeking. Stress has been found to increase dopamine release from the nucleus accumbens. The good thing about the stress response and dopamine is dopamine can help us to cope with stressful situations. A dopamine imbalance, too much or too little, can lead to altered behavior. Too much dopamine leads to risky behavior, addiction, and hyperactivity. Not enough dopamine leads to depression. Our brain works best when there's the right level of dopamine, a healthy balance. Let's take a quick review of our takeaways for this module. Our bodies have two basic stress responses, normal and uncontrolled. The main pathway and hormones involved in the body's stress response are the HPA axis and the hormones adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, and dopamine. The negative feedback switch turns off the normal stress response in the body. With an uncontrolled stress response, this switch is disabled, resulting in changes to the structure and function of body systems and organs. This leads to negative impacts on mood, learning, memory, control, and behavior. This concludes our module. Now you know a bit more about the body's hormonal system and how toxic stress can impact it. Thank you for participating in this training. Center for Youth Wellness, where health begins with hope.